It's high on a mountain, the warm winds are blowing, and where the winds are blowing to, there ain't no way of knowing. The mountain grass is short, it's dry and close to burning, crying out for water as the season's turning. Sweet smell of the pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river. I've been too long away from this wild open sky on the concrete trails that wind through the canyons dark and wide. The sounds of people talking, the words of blue and gray, smells of doors and windows.
Hello, my name is Ayana Young, and I welcome you to Unlearn and Rewild, where we explore radical ideas relating to Earth renewal. Today we're talking with the eloquent young visionary Miles Olson, who is living an ongoing experiment in rewilding. Miles has spent the past decade deeply immersed in learning and practicing Earth skills, while foraging, hunting, gardening, and gathering for his livelihood. His experiences have given him a unique perspective on rewilding, radical self-reliance, and the impact of civilization on the natural world. With any luck, he'll be taking us through the underpinnings of the existential crisis we are experiencing. It's an honor that the radio show has the same name as Miles's first book, Unlearn, Rewild. Although I wasn't aware of the book while brainstorming the show, synchronicity is not necessarily coincidence, and I think many of us are yearning for something along those lines. There's a deep collective desire to uncondition ourselves from the psychological wounds of civilized captivity and to resurrect a real relationship with nature. Hello, Miles. Welcome to the show.
How's it going?
Gosh, I'm just excited to finally speak with you about some heavyweight material. You know, it always comes down to the question of human nature. So much rides on what the natural behavior of a Homo sapien really is. Is it pointless to dream of an ecotopian, post-civilizational world at this point, as we are so deep into this other competitive, aggressive model? I mean, do you think humanity is inherently destructive, or is there an origin to this behavioral pattern that we can speculate about?
That's a complicated question because there's so many levels to it. But I think that basically the way that we can define human consciousness is it's kind of abstracted from the whole, where other animals and plants and fungi and insects and rocks and ocean, everything exists in this unified whole. Human consciousness has got this little schism from it. And I think that's existed for a really long time. I think that it predates fire and agriculture and those things. Those are physical manifestations of that kind of deep, fractured consciousness that we have that sees, we see ourselves separate. We have this ability to see ourselves as separate, and therefore we enforce that physically. And that's the world that we have, right? Is this world where we exist in alienation from the whole.
A lot of people speak about agriculture as a huge shift and what has created civilization and potentially what created this power struggle, which has then caused this type of destruction that we're living in now.
Yeah, and I talk about that in the book. Fire happened before agriculture, and I mean, no other creatures use fire, and it's something that completely altered the way that we interact with the environment and the level of kind of separation from the web of life that we could take. But I would say that those things are just surface manifestations of an internal process. There's a shift in perception, and then it manifests. We start treating the land differently. If there's a man that sees women as lacking sentience or whatever, and just treats them like a slave. The perception informs how their actions manifest. So I would say that the first thing that happened is that humans have this shift in their psyche, and then slowly we have these interesting behaviors, anomalies as far as the rest of nature is concerned, like starting fires and starting farming. And then all these other things, like we started making art along with farming, and it's kind of the essential spark that lights us up, you know. For a lot of people, it's like art is something that ignites their curiosity and their questioning and their path into finding out who they really are. But art didn't exist when humans didn't farm, and when humans lived like super simple egalitarian hunter-gatherer lifestyles. And that's because art, again, follows the shift in consciousness that farming comes out of. Like a spider doesn't make paintings because they don't have they're not living in a fractured world where you could separate things and have art here and then life there. They weave a web, and it's this beautiful thing, but it's intertwined with their life. You know, a spider doesn't have a religion, but they live a sacred life. Their devotion to the life force or whatever is unquestionable. But humans develop religion along with agriculture, and humans develop government and social structure and gender roles and all this stuff. There's certain cultures where that stuff didn't exist so much, where humans lived more in that sweet balance with the earth, and their psyche or their soul was less fractured. And you know, there was a culture that still exists that I read about in the Amazon that doesn't even have the concept of time, which is amazing to think of, right? So the human being is obviously capable of that wholeness and that interconnection with the living world. So it's not like innate or natural that humans are these destructive monsters, is the answer to your question. In the book, I don't have a misanthropic outlook on what's possible for the human being as far as their connection to life and the beauty and integrity with which we can live. And a lot of that is just based on the anthropological facts that humans have lived in balance. There are those cultures that haven't even had a time, let alone oppressive governments and a destructive relationship with the land. So from there's a few different ways you can go. Okay, so humans are not innately destructive. Does this mean that we should go back to living in that simplicity? Is that the path towards that wholeness? And if so, how?
Right.
Because we live in a world that's really eradicated that option a long time ago. I spent basically 10 years experimenting with that primitivist impulse to go live as intimately with the land as I could. I grew up in an area where there's still big enough chunks of wild space that's imaginable. So my experiment was to live as intimately as possible with the land, with a group of friends, a group of like-minded people. And the idea was that there's this basically spiritual sickness that the entire culture around us has, and that simply disengaging from that and reconnecting to nature, a process of healing would just naturally ensue, because that's what happens, I don't know, when an animal that's being domesticated is set free. That's the journey that informed Unlearn, Rewild, kind of learning the physical skills that we would need in order to support ourselves, and then some of the philosophical insights. And I think it makes it kind of a unique book because it was written by like a guy who was squatting in the woods beside the fire and and really diving into it. So that was the journey. And after many years, it became clear, and this is why I contradict myself a bunch in Unlearn, because I didn't just have a really simple argument. It's really easy to have a simple argument when you haven't put your method into practice, so to speak. If you're just a philosopher that hangs out on the campus or whatever, then it's really easy to hypothesize, oh yes, hunter-gatherers lived sustainably and we must all just model their egalitarian social structure, blah, blah, blah. Oh, that sounds good, but put it into practice and all of a sudden you have all of these traumatized, messed up human beings that have absorbed all of this conditioning and have all these layers of wounds, and put them together. And all of a sudden you have this really raw, human, complex situation that is so much more interesting. It's more interesting and more challenging. I think what I realized over the years of living in a community of people who are all living close to the land and dedicated to this, one of the things I noticed was that it wasn't connecting to the land through these different skills and practices was not actually inherently transformative, because I lived with some people who remained angry, upset, unhappy individuals despite their connection to the land physically. And that was kind of a kick in the gut for me, because my whole theory was based on, wait a minute, but this is supposed to be like the thing, you know?
Right.
There's these kind of two divergent schools of thought on where our society is headed and what will heal the problems of the individual or the society as a whole. One of them is the progress-oriented technological optimism, which says that there's always naturally going to be challenges. That's just the nature of evolution and growth. But we're going to solve them with technology. You know, right now, looking at all the big challenges like global warming, this, that, the other thing, technology is going to solve them. And we don't really need to worry about anything other than that. Now, the other one is the more back to the land or primitivist at a really extreme angle, or just more kind of slow food movement-ish, you know, a return to simpler living. And that argument says, no, we've got some serious problems here. It's not going to work to just keep on building technological complexity. We need to radically simplify and totally alter the way that we're living and our dependence on technology. Now, the interesting thing is that I realized that both of these arguments fundamentally revolve around the same center, which is technology. One just thinks we need more of it, one thinks we need less of it. And neither is true, because it's actually incidental how much of it we have around. And that might sound preposterous, but imagine suddenly the wheels of the system grind to a halt, completely stopped. Just some magic happens and the wheels grind to a halt, you know? Well, there was a time when I thought, yes, that's exactly what we need. That's the answer. I'm quite convinced, and I don't know if anyone could convince me otherwise, that I think a truer analysis of what would happen in such a case of collapse or a revolution is that, you know, by noon of the day after the revolution, people will be all back at work building the same, you know, they would be in the same oppressive patterns. They would be rebuilding the same structures unconsciously, but it would be the same, because what really builds the oppressive structures that we're surrounded by is a programming. It's internalized, right? Like it's all stuff that we carry with us internally. So it's really incidental how much or how little technology you have.
Sunrise, surprise, civilized man, you were a keeper to me, and now your animal is free. you're free to die. You're old and your hands are gray. You're old, go home and pray. We've all heard your dirty stories. 2,000 years, 2,000 years, 2,000 years of your goddamn glory.
It's an interesting question to ask what humanity would do in the face of collapse, and whether that would be enough to change our habits. You know, technology, capitalism, empire, they're all just manifestations of the patterns that are mimetically coded in our culture and our collective consciousness. We could see this as an addiction to the lifestyle and convenience of being able to buy whatever our mouths crave or whatever our fantasies crave. And our addiction blinds us from seeing the true cost of our consumption. You know, we're able to turn away from the slave labor of humans, animals, and the earth, and cave into that voice that just wants what it wants, no matter the hidden suffering or the future suffering that today's decisions will end up creating.
So what do you feel addicted to in civilization?
Well,
or what do you see as people being addicted to, if you don't?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm sure I'm addicted to more than I'm even conscious of. But, you know, moreover, I'm reliant on things. I'm reliant on being able to jump in the car and get places. And, you know, although I live in a tent in a forest, I'm still reliant on running to town and getting supplies that I haven't been able to grow or make myself, or just technology and civilization. They enable me to continue my habits, whether that's communication devices to stay in touch with people, or, I mean, I'm addicted to information, the internet.
I mean, I might be a couple steps removed from the normal consumerist experience, but not tons. You know, I have grown up in North America, and even though I've lived in the woods, I've still always kind of, you know, being in the world, if not of it or whatever, you know, like I've maintained a level of connection, understanding to mass consciousness. It seems like a lot of consumption is just unconsciousness. If you don't push on the walls of the box and push on the lid of the box to look out of it, it seems like in this world it can be you're just stuck in the box, and the amount of information in that box is not that plentiful about the nature of the things that drop into it. When I think about food and stuff, I feel like it's just we're just born into this complicated scenario, you know? Like for the most of people, they're just born into this really bizarre situation where they don't have, and they're not required to have any understanding of where things come from that they need in order to survive. And that's just like the situation they've landed in. It's really quite fascinating. The people who rebel against that and totally want to like confront the brutal truth of what's going on and are just hungry for that understanding and that the depth and honesty that comes along with that. The irony is, having lived in the woods all those years and everyone around me and myself kind of idealizing tribal life at the time, I think we all would have sucked at tribal life because the people who just go along with the status quo in this culture, those are the people who are good at tribal life, because that's the tribal life that we've got right now. Whereas for me, I remember a friend once, she was moving. She had been living in the woods where I was living for a few years, and she was leaving, and she was just broken inside because she felt like the community we had tried to build had failed. And she felt, you know, this world is so broken. It's so impossible for any of us to build community. Everything's just so messed up. And she was really feeling bad at this moment. And she's like, Miles, I just wish, I wish I was born 500 years ago. I wish I was alive before all this craziness happened. And I just thought, 500 years ago, if we were living in this valley where we're living 500 years ago, we would be doing exactly what we're doing right now, squatting up in the hills away from the ridiculous village and all of its dogma and stupidity. Because I think that in a lot of areas, that to go find truth, you've had to leave the village for a really long time, if not physically, at least psychologically. I think that process that as a teenager, I went and lived on an island by myself for a summer, and I didn't know that I was getting myself into some kind of rites of passage or something. I never would have went if I knew that was going to happen. I just thought I was going to have fun in nature because I read Thoreau or some other classic literature, and I was like, oh yeah, that's what you do. But no, it ended up being this, initially terrifying experience where I'd been a teenager, just a skateboarder kid. I had never gone and been in the woods by myself and faced all of my demons and had all my ugliness bubble up to the surface just for me to experience. But I think that process is so important. It's so important to separate, to individuate from the herd. But I don't think you actually have to physically leave the village, so to speak, in order to have that experience. I think that can help facilitate it. It sure did with me, because I was stuck on an island. I couldn't get off. So it turned into this really intense, immersive experience in nature. But yeah, I see it as just a process of dropping away the culturally constructed reality, dropping away the illusion of who you think you are, and finding out a little bit of what actually is.
I was wondering what your experience has been with the nuclear fallout from Fukushima. How did it affect your journey, and did you consider leaving Vancouver Island?
Yeah, when it happened 3 years ago, I was devastated. Everything I was hearing and everything that we were all hearing, you were in the Northwest too, so we were all just hearing there's this poison in the rain. And for me, my main source of nourishment and sanity was my connection to the earth, and therefore by extension connection to the rain, which was now tainted. So it was a real mindfuck, for lack of better words. My source of nourishment, my God, basically, was ill, was sick. It was like the sun was burning out or something. Something so central and so sacred. So yeah, definitely we thought about, should we get out of here? The mass media is playing this down, blah, blah, blah. And it quickly became clear that we weren't going anywhere. I don't think we had the means to go anywhere if we wanted to. The people that I was living with at the time in the woods, I've basically lived in the same watershed for my whole life. And so I have a real deep connection to that place. And ultimately where I'm at now, this is 3 years down the road, so we never left, and it was just heartbreaking, but just something that needed to be pushed through, to accept that there's this unknown looming threat intertwined in the very fabric of the world we're living in. But the truth of the matter is that that's the essence of life anyways. In so much of the fight or fright or flight response to those kind of disasters and apocalyptic scenarios in general, psychologically what's going on is a fear of death, right? It's all fear-based.
Right.
And the only certainty we have about our lives is death. It's the only thing that's certain. And it's kind of the wild nature of life itself, is that there's this intimate intermarriage between life and death. The more that you embrace one, the more that you can experience the other fully. So I feel like where I'm at now is to be afraid of collapse or catastrophe or fallout. All of it comes back to that instinctive fear of death, which is not really grounded in the more profound infinite nature of wild nature and real reality.
Mm-hmm.
And to someone who's really freaked out, that might be little comfort. But to me, it's of enormous comfort. It's because you can't escape the unknown. And when you say, like, how do you come to terms with that nuclear reactor is still in some process of disrepair and spewing out toxins, and it's still coming into the ocean and going up into the clouds, and how do I come to terms with that? It's kind of the same as working through the fear of death and developing a will to death, which is just smashing through the intellectual, rational, egoic part of us that wants to cling. And it's this kind of roundabout process of embracing the wild nature of life.
And those experiences, living alone on the island and going on to form a community in the forests of BC, how have they molded what you're doing now?
Well, I more take the imperative and continue with that imperative. I mean, those experiences just helps me grow and learn and understand what I'm doing more deeply. Going out into the woods and dropping the cultural constructed reality. That's the process of stepping out of dogma or stepping into relationship with what actually is. And that's something that one has to be vigilant with. It's like ongoing because it'll creep in. It's not the culture's dogma, it's the subculture that you're part of's dogma. And then it's not the subculture you're part of's dogma, it's your own dogma. And that's the hardest one to beat. And it's the one you can't see because it's sneaky and insidious. Yeah, I guess, those chapters were just informed by this deep desire to connect with the essence, the life force, the thing that I seen as a kid that was just expressing itself in the forest. Because I always felt so good when I would go into the forest as a teenager. I think it was just my own baggage and my own hang-ups. But whenever I was at school as a kid, as a teenager and stuff, I always felt so uncomfortable, so out of place. But when I got into a forest, all of a sudden this feeling of ease was around me because I was around living things, just like in the hallways of a school. But none of them had these eyes on me that were like thinking thoughts and judging. They all just had, you could feel their presence, you could feel their energy, but it was just, there's just purity and warmth there.
I am your noble savage, but to me I am the man, the father of my sons, and the server of my woman. And I have made my bow, I take only what I need. I am the maker of fire and the planter of seed. And I have learned an order in things, and I teach my children, for each seed a star, to each son a generation. I have no time for freedom. Barefoot I run on the forest leaves. There is pain in birth, but for the dead I do not grieve. I have cut marks on my body. There is beauty in pain, and the sadness in joy, like death and the sunset. I am the willing heathen, I worship everything. I will add new words to my language, but write them on the wind. I am the maker of music and the reader of the heavens. I am the worker of magic and the fearer of storms. La, la, la. I am the writer in sand, I am the first and last man, and if I could read the future, I would ask you not to come.
There is a classic dilemma of romanticizing indigeneity, the noble savage, the noble hunter-gatherer, and that debate may never be resolved. So the relevant question at this point in history may be, what are the barriers to an earth-based existence in the wake of industrial capitalism in the height of the Anthropocene extinction event? It's so unusual to hear about people who seek out an independent way of life. So I'm anxious to hear more about it. You know, what worked and what didn't work? What were the social dynamics like?
Well, if you measure something in terms of growth and learning, then the experience that me and a group of other people had was extremely profound, because we all came from having grown up in the typical North American family, which by default, even though that's a horrible generalization, it's not true, but by default, it basically means we grew up in environments where there was no clear communication. There was all sorts of super up social dynamics. Like, you know, there was all, you know, just so much invisible stuff going on that never got talked about. And so we all came from those situations and then thrust ourselves into this environment where we were codependent on one another and living really intimately. So that, you know, the codependency just ups the ante as far as social strain, and especially putting things into a context in the woods, then you're again adding to the strain because you're encapsulated separate from the city, or where a place where you can go and diffuse. Depends what you like to do. If you're like me, you would just go for a walk in the woods or a bike ride or something. If you're like someone else, you would go to the bar. There's more people to go dissipate all that dysfunction around. But if you're living in the woods, then you're forced to work through it. You're forced to either bring it up, or it just quickly will turn into a pot that boils over. So we all had to learn how to communicate in such a different way. And that was just this amazing, huge gift. And then we learned, you know, just so much about compromise and primarily communication. So some of the reasons it didn't work, I think, was another part of your question, maybe. But everyone came for different reasons, and everyone came with different wounds, and everyone brought these different loads of baggage that we're never aware of. You know, there are blind spots. That's why we carry it around with us unbeknownst. And some of the people were there because they had this like genuine kind of like soul connection to what they were doing and just living close to the land. And it was just this beautiful flowering of their life's purpose. And then others, they were just there because they didn't know what the hell they were doing. And and they loved qualities and aspects of the lifestyle we were living and all of that. But in some instances, people would end up there that actually would have thrived so much better in a very, very different environment, very different scenario. But they had built a philosophy that said, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. And so instead of going in and asking themselves and finding out, who am I, what do I need? It was just, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. And I think, like, as far as the process of rewilding, it's interesting because we have all these concepts of what's wild, what's natural, and we should go to that. But wildness is something, it's not a thing, it's a state. It's this energetic state. It's like a relationship state, as opposed to being a thing or some kind of destination or something that could be distilled easily. It's like spontaneous. That's what wildness is. It's spontaneity. It's untamable. It's completely just a product of the expression of this life force that's in everything. And there's no way of understanding how it will express itself or knowing how it will express itself, because it defies that kind of logical imprisonment. And so what I'm really interested in is, how does that want to express itself in each of us? And that might sound too airy-fairy or whatever, but there's no other real path as far as rewilding is concerned. To really engage with it is to engage with that wild essence inside oneself. And there's this quote that I heard a couple months ago. I forget who said it. It just stuck with me. It was this woman, and she said the difference between art and propaganda is that propaganda seeks to move its audience towards a specific action. You know, like if it's political propaganda, it's seeking to move its audience to vote for whoever, or sign this ballot or whatever. Whereas art seeks to move its audience to grow in whatever natural way they're already innately going to. You know, it just seeks to inspire and catalyze that movement that's already dormant inside somebody and just ready to explode open. And I think that art or propaganda, you can use any medium to create those two effects. But I think it's a really cool distinction to make. And I think it's something that it's like kind of one of the fundamental foibles that we make, is getting trapped in that logical kind of lazy thinking, or maybe just getting too stuck up in the head, and having a idea of what one should be doing, as opposed to an openness for aliveness to kind of spill through. Anyhow, so the people who were living in that community that were there because they were basically listening to some propaganda, either that came from outside or came from inside themselves, that was never going to work. And it was a really interesting process to see really close friends come to the understanding that, whoa, I have this belief system, and I realized that it never was me. And so as far as building community, real beautiful community, which I think is something that a lot of people are really, really desiring. And yeah, I totally agree in that beautiful desire for community with people, but that's like the second step. I think the first step is connecting to that essence that I was talking about, you know, that process of unlearning and rewilding, you know, and the community just like comes in as part of that, you know. Once you're doing that work, then all of a sudden community can show up, but not just some contrived dysfunctional thing of all these people who are trying to meet their needs in the wrong place, you know?
Yeah.
You know, then it can actually organically, spontaneously evolve with this real power inside of it, you know? But there's this thing in North America, ever since people started the movement towards intentional community, like 40 or 50 years ago, when the counterculture of the 60s started, and there's been this movement towards that. Well, it hasn't been like enormously successful, you know?
Right.
And I think it's because it has to start with that first fundamental step, which is, it's again that process that I talked about of individuation. Really, it's ironic because it's like, in order for wholeness, we have to go through this process of individuation. But it's, you know, that's the process of stepping away from all the things you were talking about, stepping away from that kind of mass consumer mentality that doesn't question, doesn't challenge. You know, that's the beginning of a process of individuation, and stepping away from the herd, away from mass consciousness, and finding out what's for real, and entering that process of unlearning what isn't real, and then rewilding, reconnecting.
You talk about rewilding as a dynamic process and a relationship with civilization, as opposed to an endpoint or a substitute for living in civilization. It is a state of mind as much as it is physical, but not a rigid ideology. You know, I love that you emphasize the spontaneity and the adventure and the individual investigation of these questions. There are all these stages of severance from the dominant culture and all these emotions that accompany them. It's, you know, a bit of a roller coaster. When I first started feeling this way, I wanted to rebel against everything because nothing seemed to align with my outlook. I was in the quandary of not finding a path that was pure, untainted, free from the organized crime of capitalism. So, listening to your ideas, I feel a weight lifted because you showed that this kind of ideological thinking artificially removes us from the reality of the Anthropocene. Living in a purity bubble is impossible if we see life as an interconnected whole. You know, the illness or the demise of another person or another species is the pain of everyone. So rewilding, in a way, is becoming more aware of your captivity and your dependency on the system, regardless of to what degree you renounce the system, right?
Yes. And then I'll qualify that answer now. Yeah, I do. But that's because that only works because I'm accepting my definition that I gave of rewilding, which is it's not that literal hunter-gatherer versus civilization definition. And that's a definition that I've found useful. And I still think it's useful, but I think it's more useful as a metaphor. Because what the hunter-gatherers, like, that's a terrible word kind of, because I don't think anyone would refer to themselves as a hunter-gatherer, but I'll just use it. But what a culture of hunter-gatherers is doing is, in Daniel Quinn's words, they're living in the hands of the gods. You know, it was quite a beautiful concept of Quinn's when he put it that way, because basically, you know, if you look at the hunter-gatherer's relationship to the land and to life, they're not kind of dissecting it and twisting it and conforming it and regurgitating it into what they think it should be. They're just living in the hands of the gods. Whereas the civilization, of course, doesn't do that. They assume the role of creator and destroyer. They assume that they know what's best for the land. And of course, I would say that more fundamental than the physical process of going and living in the woods or doing any of that, there's something way more fundamental than that, because that's, again, just superficial stuff happening on the surface. It's reconnecting to that rewilding. What is rewilding? What's wildness, right? I'll just in my book, I just call it wildness. Mm-hmm. There's a whole lot of different words that you could use for it. I'll just call it a spark or the essence or wildness or whatever. But it's that. How is that going inside of you is my question to anyone who wants to rewild. Because that thing in us it wants to be expressed. It wants to grow. You think of it like a plant that wants to grow and unfold, and think of it like a plant, like an oak tree. You know how an acorn already has the blueprint of what the oak tree that it will grow into is going to be, and a dandelion seed already carries this code for its imperative. Yeah, we've all got that inside of us, and it's different for each person. And to connect with that and see how it's going to unfold. So do you need to go live in the woods? No, you don't. That might, if you think that's all you need to do, then you're, gonna not really hit the nail on the head. So in the book, what I realized through writing, just through the experience of writing it, by the last chapter, there's 2 sections of ideas, the chapter Succession. I kind of realized as I was writing it, because I was just going through a process, and I had that revelation that if there was a revolution, nothing would change, because what really needs to shift is not political, it's not technological, it's not any of this surface stuff. It's deeper, much deeper than that. It's not purely cerebral either. It's deeper than that. And so it's this like really rich, amazing thing that's always there. It's always waiting to be engaged with. And it speaks to us all the time. It speaks to us in our dreams. You know, our dreams are they're wild. It's funny, it's kind of ironic that dreams are probably like one of the most potent kind of experiences of wild nature that a lot of urban people have, right? Because because they are so explicit and so common, regardless of who you are and how you spend your days. But they're another aspect of wild nature because they carry that spontaneous quality of wildness, you know? Who makes a dream and how is it constructed? And that's the genius and the mystery of wild nature and life itself. There's this intelligence, this organizing force that's making everything around us happen and be how it is. There's a big giant kernel of it inside of us that wants to be engaged with. And connecting to nature, like for me, connecting to nature has always been a way of like going to a vast reservoir of that. Because when you go into a forest, everything's just expressing it's just a pure expression of that energy. It's unhindered. And so to me, connecting to that is always, I think, most people, even if you're not a hippie or whatever, even if most people who go for a walk in the woods for a half an hour who are paying attention, they feel a little bit more calm afterwards, or their eyes brighten or whatever. It has a physiological effect. And to me, that's always been an incredible draw.
The alarm clock rings. Time to wake up. Another day it brings. Time to wake up. A day of nowhere things. Time to wake up. Your value sorted out. It's up to you. And if you're still in doubt, realize there's no use thinking. You've got to go. There's no use caring. Your boss will know. No use doing things you don't believe in.
So as you rewild, how do you handle your previous relationships with family and friends who might not share the same values?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because because like friends can change, right? And if you're on a process where you're jumping into this path or becoming who you are or whatever, you know, then your friends will usually change unless they're really, really specific individuals who want to jump on in that process with you. Family, of course, is the interesting one. My family has been fairly supportive. I mean, I got a book published and then my parents were like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. Before that, I think they were wondering, what the hell is Miles doing, you know? Mm-hmm. And, you know, they never could stop me from doing whatever I was going to do, but I didn't feel super supported. You know, the thing is, for a lot of years, I felt that civilization, like you described basically a state of mind that I've experienced a lot, mm-hmm. feeling like Western civilization, however you want to define it, is kind of the monolithic structure and evil that we need to recuperate from and disengage from. Mm-hmm. And I think there's pieces of truth to that. But as far as the individual and like where our conditioning and where our wounds come from, most of it comes from family. Way more comes from family than comes from society as a whole, because those are the people that are around us during the purity of our innocent childhood or whatever, right? Those are the people that kind of like give us our core wounds. And when you go deeper into the process of rewilding or whatever, when you go deeper into that kind of, you know, that voyage into who you really are and reconnecting and unlearning. I mean, a lot of the things that we unlearn, a lot of the things that were big roadblocks to our communication and in community, or our ability to, like kind of conduct ourselves around other people, those were things that we got straight from our parents or straight from our family or uncles or aunts or whatever. Like these wounds come in like pretty close to home. I feel like it's an area that most of the writers who I've talked to, who I've read and stuff on rewilding don't really talk about it ever. And I don't mention it in my book. But it is such a core area of our domestication, so to speak. And domestication, I mean, it's a word that's usually obviously used in reference to non-humans. It's used, you know, there's domesticated livestock, there's domesticated plants, and those are just plants or animals that have been kind of deformed by the human hand. They're usually not as strong as their wild counterparts. Yeah, they've just been conditioned by humanity. And so I think of domestication for us as humans as the same thing, basically. And there's other terms for it, like conditioning or wounding or trauma. And yeah, one of the primary places that it happens is with family, of course.
Appreciate where you are now, Miles, and the whole outlook you have on rewilding, you know, really allowing the openness and the spontaneity of life in and not judging the process of rewilding because it's messy and it's also easy to get burnt out on the destruction and focusing only on the rage. And if we can move away from that, you know, move away from all the analyzing and to actually experience life and to be able to find that wild spark inside all of us and follow that intuition. It's a really beautiful path. So
yeah, I mean, that's a big shift that's happened in me for sure. My entire cosmology has basically shifted around all that stuff. And, you know, just my understanding of the world and reality has changed a lot. And And yeah, I mean, not only does it feel more alive and better to connect to that spark in oneself, but it's also more authentic. It's more truth. Because connecting, remaining connected to that part of oneself is not all just a walk in the park. It comes with a lot of challenge, and it's in a lot of cases it's very much easy to shut down and disconnect, right? So it's not like it's a hedonistic path or whatever. It's more difficult than just getting angry and pointing the finger at some external demon, But yeah, so much of that doom and gloom is based around fear and anger, and anger can be authentic, but fear is not. Yeah, anger can be really an amazing thing, but fear is a pretty limiting and illusion-based thing that sucks us in and can be an addiction itself. Tragedy turns into life, or death and life just blend into each other. If there was like a big tsunami, or if there was a forest fire or whatever, it would give rise to the next phase of succession, and it would be part of a process of transformation. And there's nothing that's really outside of that. That's how it works. So we have this, we're clinging and clinging and clinging to some ideal, but life inevitably smears that into dust.
Oh, well, thank you again, Miles. This has been an incredible journey of the mind, and I feel like I'm floating out the window right now on top of the trees.
But yeah, no, this has been a really fun conversation. It's been great talking to you, and I really appreciate your engagement and your intelligence and your openness.
Thanks so much for listening to Unlearn and Rewild with Ayana Young, speaking today with Miles Olson. The first song you heard was an acoustic demo by Grace Slick called Sunrise, followed by Ralph McTell with First and Last Man. Then When the Alarm Clock Rings by Blossom Toes. And finally, Rainforest, an instrumental by Sandy Bull. Our theme music is Like a River by Kate Wolf. And I'm March Young.
Through the mountains like a river.